All right, I wanted to say one more thing before I moved on, though. I've been talking about Greenberg's interest in schools. Remember, he said that we've got isolated geniuses, but we don't have schools. Well, if he had any modern schools in mind, I can tell you what they would not be. They would not be the academies where people are trained simply to reproduce in a more polished fashion things which are already familiar and which can be created according to established formulae. But what he'd have in mind, though he doesn't mention them by name, I will. Certain schools that are arising in Europe in the 1920s and the 1930s. Specifically, what do I have in mind? 3 different schools, I could say, communities, societies. And in Germany, in particular in Dessau, Germany, there's the Bauhaus school. Bauhaus is the name of an awesome goth band. I won't lecture on them right now, maybe not ever. But it's the German term for farmhouse. And what they're trying to do at the Bauhaus is return to this idea of non-ornamental, simple, highly functional, sensible designs of the sort that you might see on the farm. Now, they're not made for farmhouses. They're made for urban dwellers, but they're going to be made with the same, if you will, artisanal attention to materials, to what can and can't sanely be done with them, and to designing a kind of integrated form of urban design under industrial conditions such that everyday life makes sense, that it's not an insane chase after unrealizable goals or always trying to live in the fantasy of some type of a future world or the escapist world that you see in academic painting. I mean, that's another word for kitsch, is escapism. But the goal of the Bauhaus is to rationally and integrally create a material world for ourselves, one in which form so closely matches and expresses function that to serve tea, to heat the water on this burner, to steep and serve it in this pot, and to pour it into these teacups while seated at this table with these ergonomic chairs under this chandelier, that's as intellectually rigorous and as aesthetically satisfying an experience as looking at a work of fine art. But again, it's industrial design which is done in a smart, intelligent, and integrated fashion. So the Bauhaus is going to bring in potential artists from every possible area of the arts. So there'll be textile designers, there'll be painters, there'll be sculptors, there'll be furniture designers, architects. And everybody has to take the same foundations course so that everybody gets the spirit of the Bauhaus. Everybody knows what it means to work smart, to be specific to our mediums, and to work in community, in conversation across the disciplines. And once we've got the foundations, now all of the lighting designers can go off and design light, but in such a way, using the same basic repertoire of foundational concepts, so that even though they're just hunkering down in lighting design, what they produce will integrate marvelously well, both aesthetically and functionally, with the things that the furniture designers are doing and the things that the painters are doing and that the architects. So we're creating one individual world in which, again, just walking down the street, exercising out on the terrace, all of these, because of the way that everything has been designed conscientiously and according to a rigorous program of innovation in which the integrity of the materials that we're working with and what can and cannot justifiably be expected and wrought from them, this makes going to the museums a matter of indifference. Why would you need to go to a museum when just staying home and having dinner with your family or with a few friends is every bit as intellectually and aesthetically pleasing? So this is Bauhaus. Gets going in the teens, develops into the 20s, but by the time the 30s roll around, the school breaks apart, and that's because of the rise of the Nazis. This stuff looked too suspicious to them. It seemed too intellectual. It didn't seem to reflect the spirit of the German Volk sufficiently. A lot of these people were Jewish, and they had to get the heck out. So Bauhaus breaks up. A lot of those people come over to the United States. They set up in different art schools around the country, including and especially Chicago. And quite honestly, a lot of the art and design that you see in the States from the years during and following the Second World War are going to be directly derivative of the Bauhaus. So, all the rage now, if you're into decoration, design, architecture, and all of that, continues to be mid-century modern. And mid-century modern architecture and furniture design, this all comes straight out of the Bauhaus. It's the Bauhaus brought to America. So there's that school. The other school will be De Stijl, which is a group of, again, designers, artists, sculptors, furniture builders, located in the Netherlands. Their supposed leader was Theo van Doesburg, but I think more famous than him would have been the painter Piet Mondrian. But if you look at some of their works, you will see this attempt also to create a rational and integrated, smart design. And then the third of these groups, which was built around a bunch of poets and painters and sculptors. It wasn't a school per se, but it was definitely a collective attempt to create a new and intelligent physical world, a kind of a second order nature, which would be the conditions under which it was possible to create a new human nature, a collective, progressive, egalitarian kind of consciousness that would be the antithesis of the glorification of the lone and greedy capitalist. And this will have arisen in Russia around a figure named Vladimir Tetlin, the painter Malevich, and a painter and designer as well named Alexander Rodchenko. I'll put pictures of them up there. But again, it's an attempt to design a world in which work is seen as dignified, pleasurable, exciting, collective, and egalitarian, where we're all together bringing our unique talents into combination in such a way that everybody's working, everybody's contributing, and so everybody has a personal investment in these collective projects, these collective productions, this collective property, and as a result, people might actually manage themselves better. They wouldn't feel alienated from the world that was just given to them or foisted upon them, but they helped design it, they helped create it. And as you know, things that you build yourself, things that would not be there unless you had put your mental and your manual labor into them. You treat them better. The Student Life Center, if you help build it, you're not going to, leave the weights lying everywhere, spit in the drinking fountain, leave your paper towels on the floor, neglect to flush the toilet. All of that kind of selfish and bad faith, to use a term we'll get to later in the semester, behavior is the result of feeling no personal connection to your surroundings, and therefore no personal accountability and no collective responsibility to commonly owned, commonly shared objects, environments in the world. So these are the schools that Greenberg principally has in mind: Bauhaus, de Stijl, Soviet constructivism. So I'm going to move on now really quickly to pasted paper revolution. There's that word revolution. Here I don't think Greenberg is imagining picking up guns and taking to the streets. He's simply trying to show a few basic points. This is not a long essay, but it can be rather confusing. I'll make it quick because for your sake and for my own, I want to wrap up the filming and start editing. So he's attended a show on collage by Picasso and Braque. They're the two painters who, in conversation, in conjunction with one another, developed Cubist painting, one of the major movements in early 20th century modern art. The principal thing that I want you to get out of this is pretty much just one thing, and that is this: when people see new art and are put off by it, their defensive reaction, something that I talked about earlier, is going to be to throw up their hands in disgust or despair and say, "Oh my God, I could have done that. My monkey could have done that." Give your monkey a paintbrush and enough time, enough canvases, and he'll eventually make a Picasso. And what Greenberg wants to suggest in this brief but very close reading of specific pieces that I've actually put up on the blog for you to view one by one if you want to while you're reading this essay, is these guys were not operating in any arbitrary and capricious fashion. These were deliberate experiments with pushing the boundaries of or reducing visual representation to its purest essence, and its purest essence is going to be the creation of the illusion of three dimensions, but in such a way that the two-dimensional materials employed in creating that three-dimensional illusion in no way hide themselves. You can see both the effect and the cause, the illusion and the material conditions of the illusion at the same time. Thus, what we look for in this essay is how Braque and Picasso, step by step, single operation by single operation, are trying to add something to the canvas or treat something on the canvas in such a way that that one altered variable will change everything else. Things that look three-dimensional suddenly become flat, though in the process of flattening this aspect of the canvas, something else pops out, whereupon we're going to use another means. So first it was drawing a nail as opposed to hammering a nail. Then once that doesn't work, we're going to begin to glue rope onto the canvas. That is going to make something flatten, but something else is going to pop, and so we introduce sand into our paint to make the paint not look like a translucent surface, but as an actual physical goop that is nevertheless flat as possible. Then we begin to put typeface or print onto what could be flatter than print. So it's step by step by step, experimenting one variable at a time and trying to gain ever greater control. There's nothing arbitrary or capricious about this. These guys are experimenting in their métier in exactly the same way that a scientist or an engineer would be exploring in their laboratory or in their workshop, step by step by step, controlled experiment after controlled experiment, trying to gain ever greater control over their materials. At the end of the piece, he's going to use the word monumental, and that should look a little bit odd for the sole reason that the Salon paintings, which he's been rejecting, if you ever go over to the Louvre or the Musée d'Orsay in Paris to look at them, they are absolutely enormous. I mean, it's just staggering how big some of these paintings are. I've seen a lot of art and been to a lot of museums, and the last time I was at the Louvre, I just stood there agog at the scale of Jericho's Raft of the Medusa, just unreal. So this is what we normally mean by monumental, something that is extremely large and probably extremely highly wrought. So, what's the big monument in the news these days? Mount Rushmore. Anyhow, this is what comes to mind when we use the word monumental. Picasso and Braque, their canvases are quite small. Quite often in the pieces that Greenberg's talking about here, they're not even working on canvas. They're taking pieces of sheet metal, or they're just painting on a board, or in some cases they're just pasted paper revolution from a show on collage. They're just cutting up newspapers. They're just cutting up magazines and what, like you did in grade school with the safety scissors and stuff like that. How can something so cheap and so small and so relatively simple in its execution be called monumental? And the reason is this: because through these minimal means, Picasso and Braque were able to take human creativity and human visual experience and the art and craft of painting somewhere it had never been before. The control they gain over the medium, their awareness of its ultimate flatness, and the ability to simultaneously create illusion and control illusion and reveal the means through which the illusion is created. This is a fundamental breakthrough in human experience. Doesn't have to be on a large scale. It's that the mind has gone somewhere that it has never gone before, and the physical world has taken a shape it has never taken before. Just one instance of this is when Picasso flattens so much that finally he ends up, the only way he can create the illusion of depth is by rolling paper into a tube and sticking it onto the other paper and creating for the first time not a sculpture which is made through subtractive means, but a sculpture in which space is actually constructed through the intersection of various planes. There's that word construction, but suddenly now he makes sculpture pop out of paper, and he, in the process of doing that, creates a brand new genre of sculpture, which is called drawing in space. So, you can think, or mom and dad, as you go to the Louvre or the Musée d'Orsay or the Pompidou Center, they're just goofy. This is all a hoax. Greenberg's convinced that these people are not just not goofing around, but again, they're conducting very controlled, very specific experiments with their mediums, and always with the effort of getting closer and closer to the capacities which are specific to their particular medium. Now I'll get to the plight of culture, and then we're done. He's read the latest book by T.S. Eliot, who has been an influence on him in the past. You'll remember he uses Eliot as an example of avant-garde literature that gets taught in the universities now. So he was down with him at least in 1939. By the time we get to, I believe this is 1953, he's reading T.S. Eliot's new book, Notes on Culture, and just to cut a direct path to where we need to go, he thinks T.S. Eliot's lost it. The term he's going to use is callow. You might as well call him senile. He's referring to Eliot in less than complimentary terms. But for all of Eliot's shortcomings, for all of his daughterly nature at this point, it's still worth reading this because he does at least point out one fact that ought to be understood by everybody, and that's that our culture has descended to the lowest that it's ever been. So I'll read the exact passage just because it's so horrifyingly delicious, or deliciously horrifying. Our culture on its lower and popular levels has plumbed abysses of vulgarity and falsehood unknown in the discoverable past. Not in Rome, not in the Far East, or anywhere else has daily life undergone such rapid and radical change as it has in the West in the last century and a half. So what Eliot, along with Spengler and Toynbee, who Greenberg will also mention, is saying, look, we've fallen into an age of decadence which is so extreme, this could spell the decline of Western civilization. And Greenberg is absolutely in agreement with the fact that our society has been shaken to its very foundation. In this, he agrees with Eliot, but the difference between the two is Eliot, having aged and having hardened in his outlook, has now become a reactionary, and his solution is to argue that high culture of worth can only be created under certain conditions. This needs to be a universal system of belief, a diversity of local cultures, cults, he uses the term. Oh, and a class system, a highly stratified class system. Well, he wants to go back to the Middle Ages. And it might sound to you that Eliot, believing that folk art actually is of genuine value, though we don't see much of it anymore. And Greenberg, who was quite impressed with the medieval guild system and with all of the artisanal and handiwork that went on at that time, you'd think that he would want to go back to the Middle Ages too. But he's not a lofty idealist like Eliot has become, heroicizing the Middle Ages as that time when everything was best in human history. But he's, as a Marxist and as a progressive, convinced that you can't go backward. Even if you wanted to, you can't go backward. Nor would he say that for the most part, even if you could go backward, would you want to? Because it would be foolish. He says you would have to take leave of your senses to imagine that people would be willing to give up what? Modern medicine, convenient forms of travel, refrigerated food, paved roads, public utilities, including lighting and sewer system. Nobody wants to give all of that up. But Greenberg's contention is you can't go back, nor would you want to go back. What we have to do is move forward. And the way you move forward is not by fleeing industry, but it's by going deeper into industry and following it to its natural and ultimate conclusion. Now, you can say, well, this is insanity, but it isn't necessarily. I mean, once we've become an industrialized society, you're not going to derail that. But what you can learn to do, and this is where those schools like the Bauhaus come in, it's not to work less, it's to work more, but it's to work smarter so that there's a point to what we're doing, and so that the interval dividing leisure from production is closed down. He says, the more laborious that work becomes, the more tedious and brutal the drudgery becomes, we'll notice a concomitant degradation of our hours of leisure. If you were doing meaningful, productive, enjoyable work, when the workday was over, you still had some resources left, both mentally, emotionally, and physically, in order to go do something interesting, something stimulating in your hours off. But if you've been brutalized, working a chain gang, or it's doing the same repetitive motion again and again and again, hour after hour after hour in a factory or an office, by the time you're done working, you've got no resources left to spend. And so now leisure just simply becomes collapsing in a lazy boy and staring at a TV for a few hours before we just fall apart. So the idea is not to make our way toward a society when nobody works, but it's to make our way toward a society where everybody works and where working is done in a smart way. Now, why can't we imagine that this would ever happen? It's because, we may be historical now in the way that we look at things, but we're insufficiently historical. For us, history, ancient history, doesn't go back that far. You show somebody paintings of the Enlightenment, and they're already referring to them as the Middle Ages or antiquity or something like that. We seem not to be possessed of a very powerful historical imagination. And what Greenberg is calling for here is actually investigations of the sort which have become quite cutting edge and impressive in the recent decade or two. This is the examination or the study of human culture in terms not simply of history, but of deep time. So going back and understanding human behavior in terms of Paleolithic behavior, Stone Age behavior, this gives us a much broader context under which to begin to examine our behavior in the present moment. Now, how far back is Greenberg wanting to go? He's going to want to go back as far as the agrarian revolution. So if you go back to the first cities, and this would be like Ur in Nineveh, these go back roughly 5,000 years. When we first settled down, stopped being hunters and gatherers, and with technologies which to us might seem very, very elementary, but to them, irrigation at all, tilling the soil at all, or even, bookkeeping so that we can manage people in a bureaucratic fashion. These created tremendous upheavals within the traditional way of doing things. Culture went through an enormous upheaval, but eventually it did settle down, and we moved from prehistory and from primitive times into civilization. It just takes a certain amount of time, and before we move from one order into the next, there is going to be this interval of enormous upheaval where nobody knows what's what anymore, and panic may ensue. Traditional forms disappear. We saw that happen in the agrarian revolution, though things did right themselves. And he says, look, we're only at the beginning of the industrial. It's only been 200 years at most. He's writing around 1950, so it's really only been 150 years that there's been an industrial revolution. No wonder everybody's so confused, and because we have not yet sorted out the type of world that this new technological industrial revolution is going to make possible for us, in the interim, we're going to have the worst freaking art that humanity has ever created. But the point is not to despair and to try to go back to the Middle Ages. It's to have a degree of faith, to recognize that these moments of tremendous equilibrium do settle into new patterns, and that if we do it intelligently, if we weather the storm courageously and plan properly and collectively, that what comes out on the other end is going to be unprecedented, and that it's going to create a new kind of egalitarian society where, to go back to what I said earlier, we won't need masterpieces anymore. Now we need modern art masterpieces just to show us what anything valid, anything that isn't corrupt and kitschy actually looks like, but with the collective, intelligent, and honest, medium-specific approach to the arts, and our determination to do this in schools again rather than as lone wolves, the world could turn into a place that's actually worth living in. So I'm going to leave Greenberg at that. His history does not end here. This is the younger Greenberg. He'll eventually, sometime in the 60s, with the rise of new forms of art and certain other social and political changes, and possibly as a result of becoming a cranky old man, just like T.S. Eliot did, he's going to become extremely entrenched in his formalism. The politics that was, and the history that was so important to him is going to get left out of the mix, and people are going to start accusing him of being the very kind of authoritarian that he never wanted to be in the first place. But this is what happens to leading minds. It happened to him just like it happened to Einstein. So Greenberg, after he becomes old and dogmatic and intolerant of anything new, falls out of favor, and he becomes, as it were, the go-to guy to beat up on whenever you wanted to do something new. So his name was held in opprobrium for decades, but I will say that he's been out of favor for so long that certain scholars, some of whom I've been lucky enough to interview, are starting to return to him, in particular this early stuff, and say, you know what, I think we threw him away prematurely, or even if we didn't, it's now time for us to go back, sift through the remains of Greenberg and begin to pick out those pieces which have become useful to us again. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the future. But I'm done lecturing on Greenberg for now. I hope that was interesting to you. I hope it made some sense. And I'm going to now go post... I got to edit this thing. Oh, my goodness. But I'm going to post our next 2 readings for you guys. The first one is going to be redonkulously unintelligible by a guy named Harold Rosenberg. Just skim over it and know that he is indeed as pissed off as he looks to be. Pick up some of the major terms, and trust me, I don't expect you to know exactly what he's talking about. I'll clean it up here online. And then to your great relief, the next piece, which is still relatively brief, is written by a beloved scholar named Leo Steinberg, and he's going to go head-to-head with both Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg, and he's going to do so in a way that is more approachable and ingratiating with his audience than any of these hard noses that we've read so far. So, gear yourself up to be bewildered for a few pages by Rosenberg, and don't worry if you don't understand it. And then prepare yourself to actually relax and enjoy Leo Steinberg, or as he was affectionately called by his students, Uncle Leo. So I'm out of here. Have a great Thursday. If I get this posted tonight, if I get it posted not till tomorrow, have a great Friday and a great weekend, and I'll talk with you again soon. All right.